There's something that the Republicans like, there's something that the Democrats like.
Before we have breakfast, we got to do something.
Yeah, do something.
Exactly.
When Predator stormed into theaters in 1987, audiences thought they were walking into another Arnold Schwarzenegger shoot-'em-up. Instead, they got a terrifying new kind of alien, a relentless jungle nightmare, and one of the most unforgettable twists in sci-fi history. The movie looked like pure, explosive entertainment on the surface, but behind the scenes, the atmosphere was far from normal. The cast pushed through brutal conditions, elaborate special effects, and a creature design that changed movie monsters forever. Yet in the middle of all that chaos, Schwarzenegger carried a secret he refused to share with almost anyone. It didn't affect the plot, it didn't alter the creature, but if it had leaked during production, it might have changed the way fans viewed him and the movie entirely. The brutal home that built him. Arnold Alois Schwarzenegger came into the world on July 30th, 1947, in the tiny Austrian village of Thal. And if anyone imagined a warm, easy, post-war European childhood, that picture collapses pretty fast. Austria in the late 1940s wasn't nurturing or gentle. For Arnold, childhood didn't feel like innocence. It felt like basic training. His parents kept a home ruled by strict discipline, and punishment was never far from reach. Arnold still carried a soft spot for his mother, but his father, that relationship was frozen from the start. Gustav Schwarzenegger, the local chief of police, had served in World War II, and not on the side history remembers kindly. He volunteered for the Nazi Party in 1938 and fought for Germany, surviving the brutal nightmare of Stalingrad before being discharged with malaria in 1943. A father shaped by war, discipline, and bitterness didn't make for a nurturing home. But beyond that, Gustav made it clear that Arnold wasn't the favorite, not even close. All his affection went to Arnold's older brother, Meinhard, and the reason behind that favoritism only made the situation uglier. Gustav convinced himself, with no evidence at all, that Arnold wasn't really his biological son. It was pure paranoia. But to him, that was enough. So Arnold grew up with a father who distrusted him, barely spoke to him with warmth, and routinely made him feel unwanted. And as if the emotional weight wasn't heavy enough, the family was fighting constant financial struggles. They lived so close to the edge that one of Arnold's happiest childhood memories was the day they finally bought a refrigerator. That's the kind of poverty he was raised in, with punishments at home, favoritism hanging over his head, and money worries everywhere he looked. Arnold needed a lifeline, an escape. And luckily, he found one. Sports became his refuge. His father, a former athlete, pushed his sons hard, hoping to relive his own glory days through them. Arnold started out in soccer, and for a while, that was his world. But everything changed at 13. His soccer coach took the team to a gym for cross-training, and that moment flipped Arnold's entire life upside down. Within a year, the soccer balls were forgotten. The weights took over. At 14, he made a decision that sounded ridiculous for a kid from a struggling Austrian family. He was going to become a bodybuilder, and he wasn't playing around. The gym became his sanctuary and his obsession. He trained every single day. And on weekends, when the gym was closed, he broke in just so he wouldn't miss a workout. Most people would call that extreme, maybe even unhealthy. But Arnold wasn't built like most people. His commitment started carving out a future that nobody around him could even imagine. That intensity came with consequences. When he was 18, he got himself into real trouble with the military. Austria required its young men to complete basic training, but Arnold wasn't interested in delaying his dream. He snuck out of his military camp to compete in the Mr. Europe competition in Germany. Technically, that meant desertion. He ended up facing disciplinary action, even spending time behind bars, But in his mind, the risk was absolutely worth it. From there, he began winning smaller contests, building momentum. But all of those victories were stepping stones toward the only title he truly cared about, Mr. Universe. In 1966, at 19, he boarded a plane for the very first time in his life to compete in London. He didn't win that year. Chester Yorton took the crown, and the loss hit him hard. But London ended up changing everything. One of the judges, Wag Bennett, saw real potential in the young Austrian giant and offered to coach him. Arnold was broke, barely spoke English, and had nowhere to stay. Bennett opened his home to him, letting him live above his gym with his family. It wasn't glamorous, but for Arnold, it was perfection. He was training full-time, living in the environment he dreamed of, and he even got to meet his idol, Reg Park, who later became his mentor and friend. All that grinding paid off incredibly fast. Just 1 year later, in 1967, he stormed back into the competition and claimed the Mr. Universe title at just 20 years old. The youngest to ever do it, Arnold Schwarzenegger, had officially arrived. And with his victory came the next challenge, waiting quietly around the corner: his complicated relationship with women. The darkness Arnold never spoke about. Arnold met his first serious girlfriend in 1969, an English teacher named Barbara Baker. At first, being with the newly crowned Mr. Universe felt like stepping into a whirlwind. He was charming, adventurous, and full of energy. And of course, he had the larger-than-life presence of someone who had just won one of the biggest bodybuilding titles in the world. But as time passed, the shine started to fade. Little by little, Barbara began to see sides of him she didn't like, especially as he entered one of the darkest periods of his young adult life. In 1971, tragedy struck when Arnold's older brother, Meinhard, drove drunk, lost control of his car, and died instantly. Even though the two weren't especially close, mostly because their father had driven a wedge between them. The loss still shook Arnold deeply. Yet, when the funeral took place back in Austria, he didn't go. His fractured relationship with his father played a major role in that decision, and afterward, he rarely spoke about Meinhard at all. Interviewers noticed he avoided the topic, almost as if he tucked that grief away where nobody could reach it. But even though he skipped the funeral, Arnold still found a way to honor his brother that carried real weight. Meinhard had been engaged to a woman named Erika Knapp, and together, they had a 3-year-old son named Patrick, suddenly left without a father. Arnold stepped in. He paid for Patrick's education and later helped bring him to the United States, where Patrick grew up to become a successful attorney. It was his quiet way of taking responsibility for the nephew his brother left behind. Unfortunately, the pain didn't stop there. Just a year after losing Meinhard, Arnold's father suffered a stroke and died at 65. And once again, Arnold didn't attend the funeral. The exact reason remains unclear. He gave several different explanations over the years, but Barbara Baker offered a glimpse into that moment. She recalled the day Arnold told her about his father's death, and the part that stunned her wasn't the news itself, but the way he delivered it. She said he showed no emotion at all. No sadness, no shock, nothing. And she noted that he never once mentioned his brother after the crash either. It was as if he'd already sealed off that entire part of his life. But even as he tried to move forward, his father's shadow followed him. Fame and success couldn't quiet the question that gnawed at him. Just how guilty was Gustav Schwarzenegger? Arnold knew his father had served with the Axis in World War II, but he didn't know the full extent of his involvement. And with time, that uncertainty became impossible to ignore. Eventually, Arnold reached out to the Simon Wiesenthal Center, a prominent Jewish organization known for investigating Nazi war crimes. He wanted the truth. They combed through Gustav's records, tracing every step of his wartime service. When they returned with their findings, Arnold finally exhaled. Gustav had volunteered for the Nazi Party and fought for Germany, but there was no evidence he had participated in the atrocities committed by the Wehrmacht. It didn't erase the cruelty Arnold endured growing up, but at least it answered the question that had followed him for decades. Arnold never sugarcoated what his childhood felt like. He talked about having his hair pulled and being beaten with belts, and he emphasized that this wasn't unusual in Austria at the time, but even then, he believed he got it worse, and he thought he knew why. He didn't fit into the small, simple life his father expected. He dreamed too big, argued too much, wanted too many things. That difference seemed to provoke his father more than anything else. Yet, instead of letting that abuse crush him, Arnold turned it into fuel. He sharpened his ambition against every hardship he faced. In his mind, every painful moment became another reminder of what he wanted to escape. He told himself that he would leave, that he would become rich, that he would make something extraordinary out of his life. And he did exactly that. From Austrian kid to global superstar. The 1980s became the decade when Arnold Schwarzenegger finally cemented himself as a force in Hollywood. It took him a full 10 years of grinding, auditioning, and pushing through rejection. But audiences were clearly ready for a different kind of action star. And in 1982, they found exactly that with Conan the Barbarian. His English was still rough around the edges, but none of that mattered. He had the presence, the physique, and the intensity that made him impossible to ignore. A sequel followed, and then came the role that would define an entire era, the unstoppable machine in James Cameron's The Terminator. Arnold loved telling the story behind that casting. For years, he claimed that O.J. Simpson was actually the first actor locked in to play the killer cyborg. According to him, Cameron thought Simpson just wasn't believable as a cold, emotionless assassin and shifted the role his way instead. Arnold also shared that he was originally up for playing Kyle Reese, the hero of the film, until a passionate conversation with Cameron about the Terminator character led the director to change his mind completely. Cameron, on the other hand, denied that Simpson was ever officially cast. He said the idea was briefly tossed around by the producers and immediately shut down. And that was far from the only disagreement between the two men while making the movie. There was also the matter of that iconic line, 3 simple words, that would follow Arnold for the rest of his life. He didn't want to say it the way it was written. He felt the contractions sounded too casual for a robotic character and pushed to deliver it in a more formal tone. Cameron refused. Arnold recorded the line over and over, never imagining that it would become one of the most famous catchphrases in pop culture history. At the time, he genuinely thought no one would remember it. So here he was, the kid from a poor Austrian village, now officially one of the biggest names in Hollywood. But fame in the 1980s was never a peaceful experience. Especially in the action genre, the box office only had space for a handful of larger-than-life heroes. And among them, Arnold's biggest rival was Sylvester Stallone. The two didn't just compete, they went at each other non-stop. Stallone even admitted they shared real animosity, calling their dynamic pure competition, bordering on hate. Their rivalry escalated into a wild battle of ego and excess. Each one pushed the other to make his movies bigger, louder, and more exaggerated. Arnold joked about wielding weapons meant for helicopters, describing the entire decade as all-out war. And that war took a hilarious turn when Arnold pulled off one of the most infamous Hollywood pranks of all time. Producers had approached Stallone to star in a family comedy titled Stop, or My Mom Will Shoot. Arnold read the script and immediately recognized how terrible it was. But when Stallone called to ask if he'd been offered the role, Arnold saw the perfect opportunity. He pretended to be deeply interested, knowing exactly how competitive Stallone was. As soon as Sly heard that Arnold supposedly wanted the part, he rushed in and grabbed it for himself. The movie bombed spectacularly, embarrassing Stallone so much that he later admitted it was the biggest regret of his career. For years, the two action giants threw jabs at each other, competed for bigger paychecks, and tried to top the other's on-screen body count or absurdly oversized weapons. Audiences loved every minute of it, treating their rivalry like a personal entertainment bonus layered on top of their movies. But while their feud kept the tabloids busy, Arnold's personal life was changing rapidly behind the scenes. Not long after The Terminator launched him into international superstardom, he made a major move in his private life. He married Maria Shriver, setting the stage for a whole new chapter, one that would take him far beyond Hollywood. Hollywood star turns political wildcard. Arnold Schwarzenegger was never the kind of man who dreamed small. If anything, his entire life had been built on chasing the impossible. So when he walked onto The Tonight Show with Jay Leno in 2003 and casually announced that he was running for governor of California, it felt like one of those moments where the whole room had to pause and ask itself if it heard correctly. What set all of this in motion was the political chaos unfolding in California at the time. Voters had chosen to recall Democratic Governor Gray Davis, a rare event, something the country hadn't seen since 1921. The recall election that followed turned into an absolute circus, with 135 candidates on the ballot, from longtime politicians to celebrities like Gary Coleman. So, when Arnold stepped forward, many people didn't know whether to take him seriously. The Terminator wanted to run a state? The action star whose accent late-night hosts teased endlessly? To a lot of folks, it sounded like a publicity stunt gone too far. But if there was one consistent thing about Schwarzenegger, it was that once he decided on a goal, he threw himself at it with full force. His campaign didn't look anything like a traditional run for office. With zero political experience, he relied on fame, charm, and a level of confidence that few could match. He even joined just one debate, but by that point, his superstar status had already carried him onto every television screen in the country. When Gray Davis officially lost the recall vote, Californians handed the victory to Arnold with 48.6%, over 1 million more votes than the next closest contender. The world had known him as the Terminator, but now they were about to meet the Governator. Yet the celebration barely had time to settle before the backlash came. Anyone running for office learns this fast. Once you step into the political arena, every skeleton in your closet becomes fair game. The moment Arnold announced his candidacy, opponents began hunting for anything that could derail him, and they found plenty whispers about inappropriate behavior and personal misconduct surfaced almost immediately. Then, just 5 days before the election, the Los Angeles Times published a bombshell report accusing him of misconduct involving at least 6 women. The allegations ranged from groping to repeated inappropriate comments, painting a picture that clashed heavily with his clean, heroic public image. Schwarzenegger's response was strikingly direct. He acknowledged that he had behaved badly at times and apologized, while insisting that many of the claims were untrue. In today's climate, such a statement would have exploded into a full-scale crisis. But in 2003, it surprisingly failed to slow him down. Voters seemed to shrug it off, and the election moved forward almost untouched. Meanwhile, rivals continued digging for anything that might stick. They resurfaced scenes from the famous bodybuilding documentary Pumping Iron, where Arnold openly smoked marijuana on camera. Then they pointed to a 1977 interview in Oui magazine where he discussed drug use without filters. Back then, a politician admitting to marijuana use was still enough to shock large parts of the public. But even with old controversies being dragged back into the spotlight, none of it stopped his momentum. And within a year, an entirely different kind of story began to reshape how people saw him. In 2004, while vacationing in Hawaii, Schwarzenegger found himself facing a real-life emergency that played out like one of his films. He was relaxing on the beach when he noticed a man far out in the water, about 400 yards offshore, struggling desperately to stay afloat. Without a second thought, he grabbed a boogie board and charged straight into the ocean. Later, he explained that the man was cramping so badly he could barely move. Arnold pulled him all the way back to shore and made sure he was safe before stepping away. Witnesses said he stayed with the man for a long time, talking to him, calming him down, and helping him recover. For the shaken tourist, it wasn't just the fear of drowning that left him speechless. It was the fact that he had just been rescued by the Terminator himself. The story eventually reached the public thanks to Access Hollywood host Pat O'Brien, who happened to be vacationing at the same hotel and received the tip from Maria Shriver, Arnold's then-wife. The governor's secret life revealed. In the world of American politics, Arnold Schwarzenegger didn't just stand out. He practically broke the mold. And what made him even more of an anomaly was how he approached it. Yes, he was a proud Republican, but his politics weren't cut from the usual cloth. He leaned conservative on the money side, sure, but he was surprisingly liberal on social issues. He openly supported gay marriage, defended abortion rights, and even officiated a same-sex wedding while still in office. So when he first laid his hand on that Bible and took the oath as governor, most people didn't quite know what to expect. Was this going to be a gimmick, a publicity act, a Hollywood experiment in real-life politics? Plenty of folks thought he'd flame out fast. But then he didn't, not even close. Schwarzenegger hit his stride, and before long, Californians were warming to the governator. By 2006, he was pulling in nearly 60% of the vote, an incredible feat for any Republican in a state that hadn't leaned red in a presidential race since the early 90s. In fact, no governor had enjoyed that level of popularity since Ronald Reagan, another Hollywood star who made the leap into politics and wound up in the White House. Even critics had to admit that life under Schwarzenegger wasn't so bad. And when people found out he refused his own salary, about $175,000 a year at the time, it only added to his legend. For most folks, that kind of money is life-changing, but for a man who used to earn up to $25 million per movie, it was loose change. He simply said he already had enough and would rather save taxpayers the cost. Between gestures like that and stories about him jumping into action to save a drowning man, many found him pretty hard to dislike. But every political career has its shadows, and his would soon fall under one of the darkest. Just hours before leaving office, Schwarzenegger made a final move that stunned almost everyone. He commuted the sentence of Esteban Núñez, who had been given 16 years for involuntary manslaughter, cutting the punishment down to just 7. The reaction was immediate: confusion, anger, disbelief. Why show mercy here? The answer didn't take long to surface. Esteban's father, Fabian Núñez, wasn't just a political figure. He was the former Speaker of the California Assembly and a close, trusted friend of Schwarzenegger. The commutation wasn't about justice. It was a personal favor, the kind done quietly when no one is looking. And Schwarzenegger tried to keep it as quiet as possible. He didn't notify the San Diego County prosecutor. He didn't notify the family of the victim, Luis Santos. They didn't hear it from a courtroom or a government letter. They heard it from a reporter on the phone. The news shattered them. Their fight for justice, already painful, now felt stolen right out from under them. The Santos family launched an immediate legal battle to reverse the decision. To them, this wasn't just unfair. It was blatant favoritism carried out in the final hours of a governor's term. When the case reached a judge, even he didn't sugarcoat it. He called the commutation distasteful and repugnant, but he also admitted the truth. As long as Schwarzenegger was still governor, the law gave him full authority to do it. With no legal path left, the Santos family had to watch Esteban Núñez walk out of prison just 6 years later. It became the biggest stain on Schwarzenegger's political legacy at that point, a cloud hanging over the end of an otherwise surprising run. But the truth was, an even bigger storm was waiting just beyond the horizon. You see, for more than a decade, Arnold Schwarzenegger lived with a secret so heavy that it eventually cracked the foundation of his life. And, in 2011, everything finally came crashing down. First came the announcement that his 25-year marriage to Maria Shriver was over, with Maria moving out of their Brentwood home. The world immediately began asking the same question. What could possibly break a marriage that had seemed so unshakable for so long? The answer arrived just a week later, when the Los Angeles Times revealed the truth. 14 years earlier, Schwarzenegger had fathered a child with the family's longtime housekeeper, Patty Baena. He had tried for years to keep the affair and the child hidden, but the secret unraveled as Baena's son, Joseph, grew older. His resemblance to Schwarzenegger became undeniable, and Maria's suspicions turned into certainty. She confronted Baena directly, and the truth finally surfaced. Schwarzenegger later claimed he told his wife the truth shortly after leaving office, but the reality was far more complicated. He didn't voluntarily confess. He only acknowledged what happened after Maria had already pieced it together and confronted him. The revelation shattered the marriage, but even that wasn't the most painful part. The timing made everything worse. During the period of the affair, Baena had still been working in the Schwarzenegger household. She continued her duties even while pregnant with Arnold's child. At the very same time, Maria Shriver was pregnant as well, expecting their fourth child. Two women sharing a home, bonding through pregnancy, while only one of them knew the truth beneath the surface. Joseph Baena was born on October 2nd, 1997, just days after Maria gave birth to her son, Christopher. For years, Baena kept the child's true parentage hidden, even from Schwarzenegger himself. But as Joseph grew older, the secret became impossible to ignore. When he was about 7 or 8, Schwarzenegger finally recognized the unmistakable resemblance. From that moment on, he lived with the truth in silence, doing everything he could to conceal it. But in 2011, the truth finally reached the public, and the image of a stable, perfect family collapsed in an instant. For Maria Shriver, the secret child wasn't just a betrayal, it was the crack that allowed a flood of past lies to pour out. Soon after, another name resurfaced from Schwarzenegger's past, Brigitte Nielsen. The actress had co-starred with him in Red Sonja and admitted that the two had an intense affair during filming. At the time, Schwarzenegger was already in a committed relationship with Maria Shriver. Nielsen later wrote openly about their relationship, calling it wild, passionate, and short-lived. She even acknowledged the guilt that followed her once the film and the affair wrapped. Schwarzenegger confirmed the affair himself in his memoir, describing it as a brief but fiery moment in his life. And this wasn't the first time infidelity had followed him. Even in earlier relationships, like the one with Barbara Baker, he had shown a pattern of cheating that he never truly overcame. In interview after interview, he admitted that he survived years of infidelity simply by denying everything until he couldn't anymore. He even described denial as a strategy that had always worked for him, even though it hurt the people closest to him. Those close to him often spoke about the traits that made relationships with him so difficult. Barbara Baker, his first girlfriend, eventually left him because of what she described as deep narcissism. And throughout his marriage, Shriver saw the same pattern. Schwarzenegger acted when and how he wanted, rarely stopping to consider how his decisions affected anyone else. Maria experienced that long before the final scandal surfaced. In 1997, when Schwarzenegger needed open-heart surgery, he tried to keep the entire ordeal a secret. From her years later, he made the monumental decision to run for governor without even consulting her. She found out only days before he made the announcement public. The realization that her life and her family would be thrust into the political spotlight left her shaken. He had set an entire new future in motion without once pausing to consider her feelings. This was the pattern that defined Schwarzenegger's personal life. He achieved extraordinary things, but often at the expense of those closest to him. His ambition, charisma, and sheer force of will made him a global icon. Yet those same qualities often clashed with the needs and emotions of the people around him. In many ways, he remains one of the most complicated public figures of his generation. Powerful, accomplished, deeply flawed, and entirely singular. Arnold Schwarzenegger kept it hidden while filming Predator 1987. In 1987, the entire landscape of movie aliens shifted the moment Predator exploded onto the screen. Audiences were no longer looking at some guy in a rubber suit wobbling around as an alien visitor. And it certainly wasn't just another throwaway action flick for Arnold Schwarzenegger. This story followed an elite paramilitary team sent deep into the Central American rainforest on what they thought was a straightforward hostage rescue. But as soon as they stepped into that jungle, they unknowingly became prey for an extraterrestrial creature whose favorite pastime was hunting other species for sport. Even the captured guerrilla fighter they brought along was suddenly part of the game. The film stacked its cast with heavy hitters like Carl Weathers and Jesse Ventura, giving the movie the rare distinction of featuring multiple future governors. Behind the scenes, cutting-edge effects, intricate makeup work, and intense stunt coordination turned the Predator into a terrifying, believable organism that felt like it could tear through anything in its path. And just like any film that reaches true iconic status, its title became untouchable. Trying to imagine Back to the Future as Spaceman from Pluto feels ridiculous. And Predator nearly had the same fate. Early drafts floated titles like Hunter, Primeval, and Alien Hunter. Each represented a different stage in the creature's evolution on the page, even before the final design took shape. Hunter wasn't a bad fit, and both options shared that single-word punch that suggested danger for humans and alien alike. But eventually, the creative team settled on Predator, and that name cemented itself in movie history. Sequels called Hunter or The Hunter remain an amusing what-if, but Predator became the legend. What made the film's now famous bait-and-switch truly land was Schwarzenegger himself. By the time Predator hit theaters, he was already a global superstar. But signing on to this project was still a gamble. The film actually reveals its hand in the very first shot, a spaceship drifting past Earth. After that, it pivots sharply into a jungle war story reminiscent of The Dirty Dozen, complete with huge gunfights and explosions. Director John McTiernan crafted a creeping sense of dread, especially with the early discovery of skinned bodies. But up until the alien appears, the film could almost pass for a commando-style mission. Once the jungle hunter emerges, the entire tone transforms. In 1987, when audiences walked into packed theaters expecting a standard Schwarzenegger shoot-'em-up, the reveal hit like a bolt of lightning. It could only work with Arnie in the lead. Viewers came for bullets and biceps. Instead, they found themselves pulled into a sci-fi horror nightmare where guns barely left a scratch. One of the film's most memorable scenes shows Dutch and his team unloading everything they have into the trees, only to inflict a minor wound. All that muscle, all that firepower, completely meaningless. To survive, Dutch eventually had to strip himself down, ditch the tech, and rely on pure instinct. Schwarzenegger's career wasn't exactly built on sequels. Outside of the Terminator franchise, he rarely revisited roles. Projects like The Legend of Conan and a sequel to Twins lingered for years without materializing. Total Recall didn't even get serious sequel murmurs. Predator, however, spawned multiple follow-ups, but none with Schwarzenegger, even though the original plan was to bring him back for Predator 2. Producer John Davis revealed in an interview with Collider that Arnold was in talks to return as Dutch. Negotiations fell apart over $250,000, a relatively small amount considering how massive the first movie was. Davis even admitted he still receives enormous checks from Predator's net points, noting that home video revenue alone multiplied the film's earnings several times over Predator 2, meanwhile made barely half of the original's domestic box office. Some of that might have been natural audience drop-off, but losing Schwarzenegger undoubtedly played a major part, especially since that same year he starred in Total Recall and Kindergarten Cop, both of which cleared $200 million worldwide. Arnold later explained during a Reddit Q&A covered by The Hollywood Reporter that the real issue wasn't the money, it was quality. He believed the studios often rushed sequels for profit, choosing cheaper directors or cast members instead of making thoughtful, creative decisions. In his view, none of the Predator follow-ups had truly satisfied audiences. It didn't help that John McTiernan, who directed the original before going on to make Die Hard and The Hunt for Red October, didn't return for the sequel. The studio instead tapped Stephen Hopkins, known for A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, and Arnold felt that choices like this weakened the franchise. Producer John Davis mentioned he had conversations with Schwarzenegger about returning for a reboot, but nothing ever came of it. Even Predators, the third major entry, took an interesting approach by mirroring the original structure. The characters had no idea they were in a Predator story, even though the audience obviously did. It was a clever homage, but it underscored a truth about this franchise: the shock that came from watching Dutch slowly realize what he was up against in 1987 can never be recreated. Modern viewers know the creature the moment they see the poster, while those first audiences watched the jungle unfold without any idea that an invisible alien hunter was waiting for them.